I'm Bertha Caldwell, 72, and 3 months ago, my world collapsed when my Japanese husband Kenji died suddenly during a business trip to Hiroshima. While I was drowning in grief, his sister Yuki swooped in like a vulture, claiming our home, our savings, even his personal belongings, were rightfully hers under Japanese inheritance law. She convinced me I had no legal standing as a white American wife, that after 43 years of interracial marriage, I should be grateful for whatever scraps she'd allow me to keep. I believed her. At my age, I packed my life into 2 suitcases and prepared to return to America with nothing but debt and a broken heart. But then the embassy called. What they told me about Kenji's true final wishes and what Yuki had been hiding would turn everything upside down. Before we jump back in, tell me where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. If you've ever felt powerless in your darkest moment, like this video to hear how one phone call changed everything. Looking back, I realize how naive I was to think love could conquer everything. I met Kenji in 1981 when I was 29 and working as a librarian at Oregon State University. He was a visiting professor of electrical engineering, part of an academic exchange program that brought brilliant minds from Tokyo to our quiet college town. I still remember that first day he walked into the library, struggling with directions, written in English, his dark hair slightly disheveled from the Oregon rain. "Excuse me," he said, his accent thick but endearing. "I am looking for the engineering journals section." His English was formal, textbook perfect, but his smile was universal. I was immediately charmed by his politeness, the way he bowed slightly when I helped him find the materials he needed. In those days, interracial couples were still uncommon in our small town, and I'd never imagined myself falling for someone from such a different world. But Kenji was different. He approached our cultural differences with curiosity rather than judgment. He taught me to appreciate the subtle beauty of Japanese poetry, and I introduced him to the warmth of American hospitality. Our first date was at a small cafe where he explained the difference between various types of tea, while I shared stories about growing up on my family's farm in rural Oregon. We were an unlikely pair, a tall, blonde librarian from farming stock, and a reserved Japanese engineer, but somehow it worked. The letters started arriving 3 months after we met. Every week, Kenji would leave a handwritten note in my favorite book, Always Poetry, by Emily Dickinson. His penmanship was precise, beautiful, each letter carefully formed. "Dear Bertha," one read, "your laughter reminds me of wind chimes in my grandmother's garden. I hope someday you will hear them with me." Those letters became precious to me, proof that despite the language barrier, despite the thousands of miles between our birth countries, we had found something real. That when Kenji's exchange program ended, I thought I'd lost him forever. But he returned 6 months later with a permanent position at the university and a small velvet box. "I cannot imagine my life without you," he said, kneeling in the library where we'd first met. "Will you marry me, Bertha?" The ring was simple, white gold with a small diamond, but inside the band he'd had Japanese characters engraved, "Eternal Love." Our wedding in 1982 was small, but meaningful. My parents, practical farming people, had been skeptical at first. "What do you know about his culture?" my mother worried. "What if his family doesn't accept you?" But they came to love Kenji's gentle nature, his deep respect for family, and the way he clearly adored me. His parents flew in from Tokyo, barely speaking English but making every effort to connect with my family. I'll never forget watching my father and Kenji's father attempting to communicate through gestures and shared appreciation for good whiskey. Kenji built his career at the university, while I continued at the library. And together we created a life that blended our 2 worlds. He taught me basic Japanese phrases, and I helped him perfect his English idioms. We never had children, something that caused quiet disappointment for both our families, but we poured our love into each other, into our work, and into the small traditions we created together. The call came at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in March. I know the exact time because I was staring at the bedside clock, wondering why the phone was ringing in the middle of the night. In 43 years of marriage, Kenji had never called me from his business trips. He preferred email, said it was more thoughtful than interrupting my sleep. "Mrs. Caldwell." The voice was crisp, professional, speaking English with a slight British accent. "This is Dr. Yamamoto from Tokyo Metropolitan Hospital. I'm calling about your husband, Kenji Caldwell." My heart stopped. Kenji had been in Hiroshima for only 3 days, consulting on a new semiconductor facility. At 74, he should have been fully retired, but the company valued his expertise too much to let him go completely. Is he hurt? I managed to ask. I'm very sorry to inform you that your husband suffered a massive heart attack this evening. He was brought to our hospital, but despite our best efforts, he passed away at 11:15 p.m. local time. The words hit me like a physical blow. I dropped the phone, and it took several minutes before I could pick it up again. Dr. Yamamoto was still there, patiently waiting. I don't understand, I whispered. He was healthy. He just had a physical last month. These things can happen suddenly, especially with the stress of travel and work. The hotel staff found him collapsed in his room. We believe it was very quick. He wouldn't have suffered. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, to somehow undo what I'd just heard. Instead, I asked the practical questions that seemed to matter in that moment. What do I need to do? Can I come to Japan? I need to bring him home. There was a pause. Mrs. Caldwell, I should mention that your husband's sister, Yuki Tanaka, is here at the hospital. She's been handling the arrangements since she is the next of kin under Japanese law. Next of kin. I was confused. I'm his wife. I'm his next of kin. Yes, of course, but in Japan, blood relatives take precedence in these matters. Mrs. Tanaka has been very helpful in navigating the local requirements. I barely knew Yuki. She lived in Osaka, worked in finance, and had visited us in Oregon only, twice in our entire marriage. She spoke excellent English, and had always been polite but distant. Kenji rarely talked about her, mentioning only that she was very focused on business, and had never married. I need to come there, I said. I need to see him. I understand completely, but I should warn you that travel restrictions due to the pandemic are quite strict. Mrs. Tanaka mentioned you might have difficulty obtaining the necessary visas and health clearances on short notice. My mind was reeling. Pandemic restrictions, Japanese law, a sister-in-law, I barely knew, making decisions about my husband's body. Can I speak with her? Can I speak with Yuki? She's completing paperwork with the authorities right now, but I can have her call you. She mentioned she would handle the funeral arrangements here in Japan, given the travel complications. Funeral arrangements? My voice cracked. I need time to think, of course. Please accept my deepest condolences, Mrs. Caldwell. Your husband was clearly a good man. Mrs. Tanaka will contact you within the hour to discuss the arrangements. After I hung up, I sat in our empty house as the reality slowly sank in. Kenji was gone, my partner of 43 years, the man who still left me love notes in library books, even though I'd retired 5 years ago, was dead in a hospital room thousands of miles away. And I couldn't even be there to say goodbye. When Yuki called an hour later, her voice was composed and businesslike. Bertha, I am so sorry for your loss. Kenji was a wonderful brother. Thank you, I managed. I want to come to Japan. I need to see him. I understand, but the travel restrictions are very complicated right now. You would need multiple negative COVID tests, quarantine periods, and special visas. It could take weeks, and we cannot delay the funeral that long in this climate. I felt helpless, trapped by circumstances beyond my control. But I'm his wife. I should be there, of course, and I will represent both of us at the service. I will make sure everything is done properly, according to Japanese customs. Kenji would want that. The funeral was conducted via video call 3 days later. I sat alone in our living room, watching strangers in black suits bow before my husband's casket. The service was entirely in Japanese, and I understood nothing except the final moment when they showed me the death certificate document covered in characters I couldn't read. YUK. I arrived at Portland International Airport exactly 1 week after Kenji's funeral, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing a black business suit that looked expensive even to my untrained eye. At 58, she was 14 years younger than me. Petite and precise in a way that made my own grief-rumpled appearance seem even more disheveled. Her English was flawless, with only the slightest accent, far better than it had been during her previous visits. Bertha, she said, embracing me briefly at the baggage claim. I am so sorry we must meet again under these circumstances. I had offered to let her stay in our guest room, but she'd insisted on a hotel. I think it's better if we keep some distance during this difficult time, she'd said over the phone. Now, as we drove through the familiar streets of our small Oregon town, she studied everything with the focused attention of someone conducting an appraisal. The house is beautiful. she said as we pulled into the driveway of the two-story Craftsman that Kenji and I had bought in 1985. Very American style. Kenji always said you had good taste. We sat in the living room where 40 years of marriage were displayed on every surface: wedding photos, vacation memories, the small Japanese art pieces Kenji had collected over the years. Yuki accepted tea but barely touched it, instead pulling out her briefcase and arranging documents on our coffee table with businesslike efficiency. I need to explain some things about Japanese inheritance law, she began, her voice gentle but firm. It's very different from American law, and I'm afraid it will affect your situation significantly. I felt a chill run down my spine. What do you mean? In Japan, when a Japanese citizen dies, the inheritance follows Japanese law regardless of where the person lived. Blood relatives have first priority. As Kenji's only living sibling, I am legally his primary heir. But I'm his wife, I protested. We were married for 43 years. This is our home, our life together. Yuki nodded sympathetically. I understand this is difficult, but the law is very clear. In Japan, the concept of marriage is different. Even though you were legally married in America, you were never registered as family in Japan. You are considered a foreign spouse, which gives you very limited inheritance rights. She pulled out a document covered in Japanese characters and official stamps. This is the family registry from Japan. You can see that only blood relatives are listed. Kenji never updated it to include you because, frankly, it would have been very complicated and expensive. I stared at the document, unable to read a single character. But surely, our marriage certificate means something. We have joint bank accounts. The house is in both our names. The marriage certificate is valid, of course, but it doesn't override Japanese inheritance law. As for the house and bank accounts, those may be subject to inheritance taxes and legal procedures that could take years to resolve. The Japanese government has already begun the process of freezing assets. My head was spinning. Freezing assets. What does that mean? It means that until the inheritance is settled according to Japanese law, you cannot access joint accounts or make major decisions about property. I know this seems harsh, but it's designed to protect the legitimate heirs. Legitimate heirs. The words stung. I've been his wife for 43 years. I've supported his career, cared for him through illness, built this life with him. How am I not legitimate? Yuki's expression remained carefully neutral. I'm not saying you're not legitimate as his wife. I'm explaining the legal reality. In Japan, I am his legitimate heir under the law. However, I want you to know that I don't intend to be unreasonable about this. She pulled out another document, this one partially in English. I've consulted with lawyers in both countries. The best solution is for you to renounce any claim to the inheritance, and I will ensure you receive a fair settlement. Not the full value, of course, but enough to live comfortably. I felt like I was drowning. Renounce my claim to my own home, to the life Kenji and I built together. I understand your emotional attachment, but we need to be practical. Fighting this in court would be extremely expensive and time-consuming. The legal fees alone could consume whatever you might eventually receive, and frankly, as an elderly American woman, you would be at a significant disadvantage in the Japanese legal system. The way she said elderly American woman made me feel small and helpless. Here I was, a woman who had managed a university library for 30 years, who had learned enough Japanese to communicate with Kenji's parents, who had navigated the complexities of an interracial marriage when it was still unusual, and I was being made to feel like a confused old woman who couldn't understand simple legal facts. What kind of settlement are you talking about? I asked quietly. I'm prepared to offer you $50,000 and 60 days to vacate the house. I know it's not ideal, but it's more than you would receive under strict Japanese law, and it avoids years of legal complications. $50,000 for a house worth at least $400,000, for a lifetime of memories, for the security I thought I'd built with my husband. I looked around at our living room, at the handmade quilt my mother had given us as a wedding gift, at the bookshelf filled with volumes in both English and Japanese, at the framed photo of Kenji and me on our 40th anniversary. I need time to think, I said. Of course, Yuki replied, gathering her documents, but I should mention that the legal processes in Japan move quickly. The longer we wait, the more complicated everything becomes. Over the next 2 weeks, Yuki systematically dismantled my life with the precision of a surgeon. She arrived at the house each morning at exactly 9 o'clock, armed with clipboards, camera, and an endless supply of official-looking documents. She claimed she needed to inventory everything for the Japanese authorities, but I began to suspect she was simply cataloging her future possessions. "This is very valuable," she would say, photographing Kenji's collection of vintage Japanese woodblock prints. "These are authentic Hiroshima pieces. They must be properly documented for the inheritance assessment." I watched helplessly as she assigned monetary values to items that held immeasurable sentimental worth. The tea set his mother had given us for our wedding became mid-century ceramic, approximately $800. The handmade shoshi screen that had taken Kenji months to construct in our garage was reduced to decorative room divider, $200. "What about this?" I asked, holding up a small ceramic bowl that Kenji had made in a pottery class during his retirement. It was imperfect, slightly lopsided, but he'd been so proud of it. "Why UK?" I barely glanced at it. "Personal craft items have no inheritance value. You can keep things like that." The casual dismissal of something Kenji had created with his own hands infuriated me, but I was beginning to understand the game. Anything that could be sold had inheritance value and thus belonged to her. Anything sentimental or personal was mine to keep, but only because it was worthless to anyone else. The bank statements were particularly devastating. Yuki spread them across our dining room table, pointing out deposits and withdrawals with the detached efficiency of an accountant. "You can see here that most of the major deposits came from Kenji's salary and consulting fees. Your teacher's pension and library wages were much smaller." "We were married," I protested. "Everything we earned together. I supported his career, managed our home, made it possible for him to focus on his work." "I understand that, but the Japanese authorities need to see clear financial contributions. Your name may be on the accounts, but the majority of the actual funds came from Kenji's income. This creates a legal presumption that he was the primary owner." She showed me another document, this one with official stamps and signatures. "The Bank of Tokyo has already frozen the accounts pending resolution of the inheritance. You currently have access to approximately $3,200 in your individual checking account, which should be sufficient for immediate expenses." $3,000. After 43 years of marriage, of building a life together, of careful saving and planning for retirement, I was left with $3,000 and whatever items Yuki deemed sentimental but valueless. "What about my teacher's pension?" I asked. "That remains yours, of course, and Social Security, when you're eligible. But any joint assets, any property accumulated during the marriage, any investments made with combined funds, those fall under Japanese inheritance law." I felt like I was being erased, systematically removed from my own life. The woman who had been Kenji's partner, his equal, his beloved wife, was being reclassified as a dependent who had contributed nothing of value to their shared existence. "I don't understand how this can be legal," I said. "We lived in America, we paid American taxes, we were married under American law." Yuki's expression remained patient but firm. "Kenji remained a Japanese citizen throughout your marriage. He never became an American citizen, which means his estate is subject to Japanese law. I know it seems unfair from an American perspective, but every country has its own legal system." She pulled out yet another document, this one partially translated into English. "This is a statement from the Japanese consulate confirming that your marriage, while legally valid, does not override inheritance statutes for Japanese citizens. As a foreign spouse, you have some rights, but they are limited." The phrase foreign spouse had become a weapon, a way to diminish my 43 years of marriage to a legal technicality. I was no longer Kenji's beloved wife. I was a foreign spouse with limited rights. "However," Yuki continued, "I want to be fair. I'm prepared to increase my settlement offer to $75,000. That, combined with your pension and Social Security, should provide you with a comfortable retirement. $75,000. For a house, a lifetime of savings, decades of shared investments, and the security I'd thought we'd built together." I looked at the bank statements spread across the table, at the neat columns of numbers that represented years of careful financial planning, and I felt utterly defeated. "I need more time," I said. "Of course, but I should mention that the Japanese processing fees increase the longer this takes, and there are storage costs for items that need to be shipped to Japan." The settlement amount may need to be adjusted downward if we delay much longer. That night, I sat in our bedroom surrounded by boxes of photographs, trying to decide which memories I could fit into the 2 suitcases that would constitute my entire remaining possessions. 43 years of marriage, and I was being asked to choose between a photo of our wedding day and a picture of Kenji teaching me to use chopsticks on our honeymoon. I found myself wondering if I'd ever really known my husband at all. How could he have left me so vulnerable? How could he have failed to protect me from this legal nightmare? But then I remembered the way he'd held my hand during every medical appointment. The way he'd learned to make my grandmother's apple pie recipe, the way he'd whispered, "I love you" in both English and Japanese every night before we went to sleep. The man I'd loved for 43 years wouldn't have wanted this for me, but the legal system he'd been born into apparently didn't care what he would have wanted. Desperation drove me to spend money I couldn't afford on lawyers who seemed more confused than helpful. The first attorney, a kind but overwhelmed family law practitioner in downtown Portland, listened sympathetically but admitted he'd never handled an international inheritance case involving Japanese law. "This is quite complex, Mrs. Caldwell," he said, reviewing the documents Yuki had provided. "International estate law isn't my specialty, but I can tell you that different countries have very different approaches to inheritance. Some follow the law of the deceased's citizenship, others follow the law of residence. So which law applies to my situation?" I asked, hoping for a clear answer. "That's where it gets complicated. Your husband maintained Japanese citizenship, which gives Japanese law a strong claim, but you were married in Oregon, lived in Oregon, and accumulated most of your assets in Oregon. A good international lawyer might be able to argue for American jurisdiction. Might be able to argue." The uncertainty in his voice made my stomach clench. "What would that cost?" "International litigation is expensive, Mrs. Caldwell. We're talking about hiring specialists, possibly traveling to Japan for depositions, translating documents, navigating to different court systems. You could easily spend $100,000 or more, with no guarantee of success. $100,000 I didn't have, fighting a system I didn't understand, against a woman who seemed to have all the advantages." I thanked him and left, feeling more hopeless than before. The second lawyer specialized in international estate disputes and charged $300 just for the consultation. She was more knowledgeable, but less encouraging. "Japanese inheritance law heavily favors blood relatives," she explained. "Even if we could establish American jurisdiction, which is doubtful, the practical reality is that most of the assets may already be beyond our reach." "What do you mean?" I asked. "If the Japanese authorities have frozen accounts and begun inheritance proceedings there, reversing that process from America becomes extremely difficult. It's not impossible, but it would require cooperation from Japanese courts, which they're not obligated to provide." She showed me examples of similar cases, most of which had dragged on for years and resulted in massive legal fees with minimal recovery for the surviving spouses. "I'm not trying to discourage you from pursuing justice, Mrs. Caldwell, but I want you to understand the realities. International inheritance disputes are complex, expensive, and often disappointing." "So you're saying I should just accept what Yuki is offering?" "I'm saying you need to weigh the costs against the potential benefits. Fighting this could cost you everything you have left, including your peace of mind." Meanwhile, Yuki continued to present me with documents that seemed to support her position. She showed me official letters from Japanese banks, translated legal opinions from Tokyo lawyers, and correspondence with the Japanese Ministry of Justice. Everything looked legitimate, covered with official stamps and signatures that I couldn't verify. "I've been in contact with the American embassy in Tokyo," she told me during one of her daily visits. "They confirmed that this situation falls under Japanese jurisdiction. They cannot intervene in inheritance matters governed by foreign law." The phrase foreign law stung every time she used it. Here I was, an American citizen in my own country, being told that foreign law controlled my fate. The marriage certificate hanging in our hallway, issued by the state of Oregon, apparently meant nothing when confronted with Japanese inheritance statutes. "But surely the embassy can at least verify these documents?" I asked. "They did verify them. That's how I know the process is legitimate. They told me that many American spouses of Japanese citizens face similar situations, and the best advice is usually to work cooperatively with the blood relatives, rather than fighting in foreign courts." I called the embassy myself, waiting on hold for 45 minutes before reaching a junior consular officer who sounded barely old enough to be out of college. "Ma'am, we can't provide specific legal advice about inheritance disputes," he said. "But in general, when a Japanese citizen dies, Japanese law typically governs the distribution of assets, regardless of where the couple lived. So there's nothing you can do to help. We can provide a list of lawyers who specialize in international estate law. But beyond that, these matters are usually resolved through the Japanese legal system." Every conversation left me feeling smaller and more powerless. The confident, competent woman who had managed a university library, who had navigated the complexities of an interracial marriage in less tolerant times, who had built a successful life with her immigrant husband, was being reduced to a confused elderly woman who didn't understand the legal realities of her situation. Yuki seemed to sense my growing desperation. "I know this is overwhelming," she said with practiced sympathy. "The legal systems are so different between our countries. But I want you to know that I'm trying to make this as easy as possible for you. The settlement I'm offering is really quite generous, considering what the law actually requires." "What does the law actually require?" I asked. She pulled out another document, this one entirely in Japanese except for a few English phrases. "Under strict Japanese inheritance law, foreign spouses are entitled to only 1/3 of the estate, and only if there are no blood relatives. Since I am Kenji's sister, your legal share would be much smaller, perhaps 10 to 15%. 10 to 15% of my own life, of the house I'd helped choose, the investments I'd helped fund, the savings I'd helped accumulate over 43 years of marriage. The legal system was telling me I was worth 10% of my own existence." My friends were horrified when I explained what was happening. Margaret, who lived next door and had watched Kenji tend our garden for 20 years, was the first to voice what others were thinking. "This doesn't sound right, Bertha," she said as we sat in her kitchen, away from Yuki's daily presence in my house. "I've known you and Kenji since you moved to the neighborhood. He adored you. He would never have left you vulnerable like this." "But the documents seemed legitimate," I said, showing her the translated papers Yuki had provided. "Look at all these official stamps." Margaret, a retired high school principal with a sharp eye for detail, studied the papers with growing skepticism. "How do you know these translations are accurate? How do you know these stamps are real? Bertha, you're taking this woman's word for everything, and she's the one who benefits from your confusion." Her words hit me hard because they echoed doubts I'd been trying to suppress. "But she's Kenji's sister. Why would she lie to me? Money makes people do terrible things, even to family members," Margaret replied. "Remember, you barely knew this woman. How many times did she visit in 43 years? Twice, 3 times." I thought back to those rare visits. Yuki had always been polite, but distant, speaking Japanese with Kenji in conversations I couldn't follow. She'd shown little interest in our life in America, asking few questions about my work or our shared experiences. Now I wondered what those private conversations had really been about. "And another thing," Margaret continued, "if Japanese law is so clear-cut, why is she negotiating with you? Why offer settlements and deals? Wouldn't she just take everything if the law was really on her side?" My friend Patricia, a nurse who'd worked with international families at the hospital, raised another concern when she stopped by later that week. "I've seen a lot of mixed-culture families over the years," she said. "The men who truly love their American wives usually take steps to protect them. They get citizenship, they set up wills, they make sure their wives won't be left vulnerable to foreign laws." "Maybe Kenji didn't think about it," I said weakly. "Bertha, Kenji was an engineer. He thought about everything. Remember how he researched every major purchase for months. Remember how he kept detailed files about insurance, investments, and legal documents. A man that careful doesn't accidentally leave his wife of 43 years unprotected." She was right. Kenji had been meticulous about planning. He'd researched our mortgage options for 6 months before buying the house. He'd spent weeks comparing insurance policies. He'd even created a detailed filing system for our tax returns, dating back to our first year of marriage. The idea that he'd overlooked something as important as inheritance protection seemed completely out of character. "Have you actually seen his will?" Patricia asked. "Yuki said he died without a proper will, which is why everything falls under default inheritance law. But did you see documentation of that? Did you see official statements saying no will exists?" I realized I hadn't. I'd simply accepted Yuki's word that no will existed. just as I'd accepted her explanations about Japanese law, her translations of legal documents, and her claims about embassy communications. That evening, I found myself looking through Kenji's study with new eyes. He'd been obsessively organized, keeping files for everything from appliance warranties to investment statements. Surely a man this methodical would have created some kind of estate planning documents. I pulled out his filing cabinet and began going through every folder systematically. Most contained exactly what I expected: tax returns, insurance policies, bank statements, correspondence with his employer. But in the back of the bottom drawer, I found something that made my heart race: a folder labeled Estate Planning in Kenji's careful handwriting. Inside were business cards for 3 different lawyers, notes about Oregon inheritance law, and research he'd apparently done about protecting assets in mixed nationality marriages. There were also photocopies of articles about Japanese-American inheritance disputes, with passages highlighted in yellow marker. At the bottom of the folder was a small notebook filled with Kenji's handwriting, mostly in English but with occasional Japanese phrases. I couldn't read the Japanese parts, but the English sections were clearly notes about legal strategies for protecting American spouses from foreign inheritance laws. One entry, dated just 6 months before his death, made my blood run cold. Yuki called again, asking about our financial situation. Told her it was private matter. She seemed angry. Must ensure Bertha is protected if something happens to me. My hands were shaking as I read those words. Kenji had been concerned about Yuki's interest in our finances. He'd been actively researching ways to protect me, and he'd documented her anger when he refused to share details about our assets. Another entry, dated 3 months before his death, was even more revealing. Meeting with lawyer next week about updating will. Must ensure all assets transfer to Bertha regardless of Japanese law. Cannot trust family to do right thing. The notebook slipped from my hands as the full impact hit me. Kenji had known. He'd known that his family couldn't be trusted to treat me fairly. He'd been actively working to protect me from exactly what was happening now. But if he'd been working with a lawyer to update his will, where was that will? And why was Yuki claiming that no will existed? I looked at the business cards in the folder. 3 different attorneys, all specializing in estate planning and international law. Tomorrow, I would start calling them. Tonight, for the first time since Kenji's death, I felt something other than despair. I felt anger. Yuki's patience was wearing thin. She arrived earlier each morning and stayed later each evening, her polite veneer cracking to reveal something harder underneath. "We really need to finalize this arrangement," she said, watching me sort through 43 years of accumulated memories. "I have obligations in Japan that require my attention." I was supposed to be packing my entire life into 2 suitcases, but every item I touched seemed to carry the weight of our shared history. How do you choose between your wedding dress and the quilt your mother made? Between your husband's love letters and the photographs of your honeymoon? Between books that shaped your thinking and artwork that shaped your home? "This is taking too long," Yuki observed, checking her expensive watch. "Perhaps I can help you decide what's truly essential." She began making suggestions with brutal efficiency. "You don't need all these books. You can buy new ones wherever you settle. These kitchen items are just taking up space. You'll probably move to a smaller apartment anyway. And honestly, how many photo albums does one person need?" Each dismissal felt like a small death. These weren't just possessions. They were the physical manifestations of a life well lived, of love carefully tended over decades. But Yuki saw only clutter to be disposed of, obstacles to her inheritance. "What about this?" I asked, holding up the ceramic tea set that Kenji's mother had given us as a wedding gift. "It has sentimental value. It also has monetary value," Yuki replied, making a note on her clipboard. "Authentic Japanese ceramics from that period are quite collectible. It needs to be included in the estate inventory." I felt something break inside me. Even the gifts from Kenji's own mother, given to welcome me into the family as a daughter-in-law, were being stripped away. The woman who had embraced me despite the language barrier, who had taught me to make proper miso soup, who had accepted her son's choice to marry a tall blonde American librarian, would be horrified to see her gift being treated as a commodity. "I have an idea," Yuki said, her tone becoming more businesslike. "Why don't I handle the packing for you? I can arrange for professional movers to sort everything efficiently. You can focus on your travel arrangements and finding a new place to live." The thought of strangers or worse, Yuki going through our intimate possessions made me feel sick. No, I need to do this myself, but you're being too emotional about it. You're attached to things that have no practical value. A professional approach would be much more efficient. That's when I found it, wedged between two books on Kenji's desk. A small leather journal I'd never seen before. The cover was worn, and the pages were filled with his careful handwriting in both English and Japanese. My heart pounded as I realized what I was holding: Kenji's personal thoughts, written in his own words, away from prying eyes. "What's that?" Yuki asked sharply, moving toward me with sudden interest. "It's just a notebook," I said, trying to keep my voice steady while slipping it into my purse. "Let me see it. If it contains business information or financial records, it may be relevant to the estate. It's personal." Just his thoughts about gardening and retirement plans. Yuki's eyes narrowed, and for a moment I saw something that looked like panic flash across her face. "Bertha, you cannot keep documents. That might affect the inheritance. That could be considered concealment of assets." "It's a personal journal," I said firmly. "It has nothing to do with assets." But even as I said it, I wondered if that was true. Why was Yuki so interested in a simple notebook? Why did she seem nervous about what it might contain? "I really think I should review it," she insisted. "As the primary heir, I have a responsibility to examine all of Kenji's documents." "No," I said, surprised by the strength in my own voice. "Some things are private, even in death." For a moment, we stared at each other across the cluttered room, and I saw a flash of the real Yuki, not the polite, sympathetic sister-in-law, but someone calculating and determined. Then the mask slipped back into place. "Of course," she said, smoothly. "I'm sorry if I seemed pushy. I'm just trying to ensure everything is handled properly." But I noticed that for the rest of the day, she kept glancing at my purse where the journal was hidden. And when she left that evening, she seemed more agitated than usual. "We really need to conclude this by the end of the week," she said at the door. "I've already arranged for the house to be listed with a real estate agent. The market is very good right now." "You've already listed our house?" I was stunned. "I've made preliminary arrangements. Nothing final, of course, but we need to move quickly to get the best price. The longer we wait, the more complicated everything becomes." After she left, I sat in our bedroom, soon to be just a bedroom, no longer ours, and opened Kenji's journal with trembling hands. The entries were dated over the past 2 years, a mixture of daily observations and deeper reflections. But, as I read, certain themes began to emerge that made my blood run cold. Many entries mentioned Yuki's increasingly frequent phone calls, her questions about our finances, and her suggestions that Kenji should prepare for the future by transferring assets to Japan for tax advantages. He'd written about feeling pressured by her urgency and suspicious of her motives. One entry from 8 months ago was particularly chilling. "Yuki called again today. She seems to know too much about our bank balances and investments." When I asked how she knew these details, she became evasive. "I'm beginning to wonder if she's been investigating our finances without permission." Another entry, from just 4 months before his death, revealed the depth of his concern. "Spoke to lawyer today about protecting Bertha. Yuki's behavior becoming more concerning. She actually suggested I should make arrangements in case of unexpected health problems." The way she said it made me uncomfortable. "Must ensure Bertha is completely protected from family interference." As I read those words, written in my husband's careful hand, I finally understood the truth. This wasn't about inheritance, law, or cultural differences or legal complexities. This was about greed, manipulation, and a carefully planned theft that had begun long before Kenji's death. And I was no longer going to be its victim. The one-way ticket to Portland that Yuki purchased for me felt like a death sentence. She insisted on handling the travel arrangements herself, claiming it would be more efficient and that she had connections who could get better prices. Now I understood it was about control. Ensuring I left on her timeline, with her limitations. "The flight leaves Saturday morning," she announced, placing the printed boarding pass on our kitchen table like a piece of evidence. "I've arranged for a car service to take you to the airport. Very convenient." Saturday was only 4 days away. 4 days to say goodbye to the life I'd built over 4 decades. To the home where I'd planned to grow old with Kenji. To the community where I was known and valued. For days to pack a lifetime into 2 suitcases and disappear. "Where exactly am I supposed to go?" I asked. "I don't have family in Portland anymore. My sister died 3 years ago. There are many nice senior communities in the Portland area, Yuki replied with practiced sympathy. With the settlement money, you'll be able to find a comfortable apartment, maybe even make some new friends. Senior communities, the phrase made me feel ancient and disposable. I was 72, not 92. I was still healthy, still capable, still vital. But in Yuki's narrative, I was a confused elderly woman who needed to be managed and relocated. I've also arranged for a storage unit, she continued, pulling out another set of documents, for items that won't fit in your luggage but have sentimental value. You can access them whenever you visit the area. Visit the area, as if Oregon, where I'd lived for over 40 years, would now be just a place I might occasionally visit, as if the town where I'd worked, volunteered, and built friendships would become foreign territory. I could only access by permission. But it was the timeline that bothered me most. Why the sudden urgency? For weeks, Yuki had been methodical and patient, carefully documenting every possession and explaining every legal requirement. Now she seemed desperate to get me out of the house and out of the state as quickly as possible. Why the rush? I asked. You said the legal processes could take months. The Japanese authorities prefer to take possession of the property quickly, she replied, but something in her voice seemed forced. Empty houses create liability issues, and, frankly, it's emotionally healthier for you to start fresh, rather than lingering in a place filled with memories. That evening, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of continuing to pack, I drove to the Portland International Airport and went to the ticketing counter for the airline Yuki had chosen. I need to check on a reservation, I told the agent, showing her the boarding pass. Let me look that up for you, she said, typing into her computer. After a moment, she frowned. I see the reservation, but it's interesting it's listed as a one-way ticket purchased with a Japanese credit card. The purchaser's name is Yuki Tanaka. Is this person a relative? Yes, my sister-in-law. Is there anything unusual about that? Not unusual, but I noticed there's also a note in the system that this ticket is non-refundable and non-changeable. That's a bit restrictive for someone your age traveling alone. Non-refundable, non-changeable. Yuki had purchased a ticket designed to ensure I couldn't alter my departure, couldn't change my mind, couldn't fight back once I was gone. Can I purchase a different ticket if I wanted to change my travel plans? I asked. Of course, but you'd have to pay the full fare for a new ticket. This one couldn't be cancelled or credited. I thanked her and drove home with my mind racing. Yuki wasn't just eager to get rid of me, she was terrified that I might discover something before I left. The restrictive ticket, the sudden urgency, the refusal to let me handle my own travel arrangements, it all pointed to someone desperately trying to maintain control over a situation that was slipping away from her. That night, I called the first lawyer whose business card I'd found in Kenji's filing cabinet. The phone rang 4 times before an answering service picked up, but I left a detailed message explaining my situation and asking for an urgent callback. The second lawyer's office was closed, but the third one had an emergency number. I reached a tired-sounding man who listened patiently as I explained my situation. Mrs. Caldwell, I remember your husband, he said, and my heart leaped. Kenji came to see me about 6 months ago. We discussed updating his estate planning documents. Did he create a new will? I asked, hardly daring to breathe. We began the process, but he wanted to do some additional research before finalizing everything. He was particularly concerned about protecting American assets from foreign inheritance claims. He mentioned having some family concerns. What kind of family concerns? He was worried that certain relatives might try to claim inheritance rights that could disadvantage you. He wanted to ensure that wouldn't happen. My hands were shaking as I held the phone. So he never completed a new will. Not with my office, but he mentioned he might consult with specialists in international estate law. Have you checked with other attorneys? I promised to do that and thanked him for the information. But as I hung up, I felt more confused than ever. If Kenji had been actively working to protect me, why was I in this situation? Had he run out of time? Had he trusted the wrong people? Or was there something I still wasn't seeing? I spent the rest of the night reading through his journal more carefully, looking for clues I might have missed. One entry from 2 months before his death caught my attention. Meeting with Embassy Legal Attach next week. Want to understand options for protecting B if something happens during business travel to Japan. Embassy Legal Attach. Kenji had consulted with someone at the U.S. Embassy about protecting me in exactly the situation I now faced. But if he'd taken steps to protect me, where was the evidence? Where were the documents? Where was the protection he'd tried to provide? As Saturday approached and my departure became imminent, I realized I was missing something crucial. Kenji had been too careful, too thorough, too loving to leave me completely vulnerable. Somewhere, somehow, he had left me a way to fight back. I just had to find it before Yuki's carefully orchestrated timeline removed me from the equation entirely. The call came at 2:17 p.m. on Friday, less than 18 hours before my scheduled departure. I was in the bedroom, folding the last of my clothes into the second suitcase, when the phone rang. I almost didn't answer. Yuki had been calling constantly to confirm departure details, and I couldn't bear another conversation about logistics. Mrs. Caldwell, this is David Chen from the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo. I'm calling about your husband, Kenji Caldwell. My heart stopped. Yes, I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am. I understand this is a difficult time, but I have some important information that couldn't wait. Are you able to speak privately? I looked around the bedroom where Yuki was supposed to arrive within the hour for final preparations. Yes, I'm alone. Mrs. Caldwell, your husband contacted our legal section several months before his death. He was concerned about protecting your inheritance rights in the event something happened to him while he was in Japan. We've been trying to reach you, but the contact information we had was apparently outdated. My legs gave out, and I sat heavily on the bed. What kind of protection? Your husband filed several documents with our office, including a properly executed will that explicitly leaves all his assets to you. He also provided us with copies of your marriage certificate, joint financial records, and documentation establishing your legal rights as his spouse under both American and international law. The room was spinning, but his sister said no will existed. She said everything fell under Japanese inheritance law. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Mrs. Caldwell, that's simply not true. Your husband was very thorough. He consulted with our legal attach about the best ways to ensure Japanese inheritance law couldn't override his wishes regarding American assets. I don't understand. Yuki showed me documents from Japanese lawyers, correspondence with banks, official statements about inheritance law. Ma'am, I need to ask you some questions. Has anyone pressured you to sign documents renouncing your inheritance rights? Has anyone claimed to represent Japanese legal authorities in dealings with your husband's estate? Yes, both of those things. Yuki has been handling everything. She said I had no legal standing as a foreign wife. Mrs. Caldwell, I'm afraid you may be the victim of inheritance fraud. Your husband specifically anticipated this possibility and took legal steps to prevent it. Can you tell me exactly what documents you've been shown and what you've been asked to sign? With shaking hands, I described everything Yuki had told me, every document she'd presented, every legal claim she'd made. As I spoke, I could hear Mr. Chen typing, occasionally asking for clarification or additional details. This is exactly what your husband was worried about, he said when I finished. He told us his sister had been pressuring him for financial information and making suggestions about transferring assets to Japan. He was concerned she might try to exploit Japanese inheritance laws to defraud you. So the documents she showed me, some may be legitimate but taken out of context. Others are likely forgeries. Mrs. Caldwell, Japanese inheritance law does give preferences to blood relatives, but it doesn't override a properly executed will, especially for assets held in foreign countries. Your husband's American assets, including your home and bank accounts, are protected by his will and by international treaties. I felt like I was emerging from a nightmare into daylight, but she froze our bank accounts. She said the Japanese government had seized our assets. That's impossible without a court order, which would require formal legal proceedings that haven't occurred. Mrs. Caldwell, I need to ask, have you given this woman any financial information? Has she had access to your accounts or documents? My blood ran cold as I remembered the bank statements Yuki had photographed, the documents she'd copied, the financial information she'd gathered during her inventory process. She's been documenting everything. She said it was for the Japanese authorities. I'm afraid she may have been gathering information for unauthorized access to your accounts. This is a serious matter that requires immediate attention, but I'm supposed to leave for Portland tomorrow morning. The ticket's already purchased. The house is supposed to be listed. Mrs. Caldwell, please don't travel anywhere until we can sort this out, and whatever you do, don't sign any documents or give this woman any additional access to your financial information. As if summoned by my newfound knowledge, I heard Yuki's car pulling into the driveway. "She's here," I whispered, into the phone. "Don't confront her yet. Act normally while we verify everything and determine the extent of the fraud. I'm going to contact our legal attach and have him call you within the hour with specific instructions. Can you do that?" "Yes," I managed to say, "and Mrs. Caldwell, your husband loved you very much. Every document he filed, every precaution he took, was designed to protect you from exactly what's been happening. You're not alone in this." I hung up just as Yuki knocked on the front door. For the first time in months, I felt something other than despair and confusion. I felt anger, clean, righteous anger at being manipulated and defrauded by someone who should have been family. But more than that, I felt loved. Even in death, Kenji had been protecting me. The careful, methodical man I'd married had anticipated this betrayal and taken steps to prevent it. He'd known his sister better than I had, and he'd prepared for the worst while hoping for the best. As I walked to answer the door, I touched the wedding ring that Yuki had told me had no legal significance. The inscription inside, those Japanese characters meaning eternal love, suddenly felt like a promise kept. Kenji's love was protecting me still, reaching across death and distance to bring me justice. "Ready for your big journey tomorrow?" Yuki asked brightly as I opened the door. "Actually," I said, meeting her eyes with newfound confidence, "I think there's been a change of plans." The embassy's legal attach called back exactly 1 hour later. Just as Yuki was going through her final checklist for my departure, I answered the phone in the kitchen while she sorted through papers in the living room, speaking quietly to avoid being overheard. "Mrs. Caldwell, this is James Morrison, legal attach at the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo. I worked directly with your husband on his estate planning concerns. I have his complete file in front of me." "What exactly did he file?" I whispered. "A comprehensive will executed according to both Oregon and international law, specifically designed to protect American assets from foreign inheritance claims. He also filed power of attorney documents giving you complete control over all financial decisions and a sworn affidavit stating his concerns about potential family interference." My hands were trembling as I held the phone. "But why didn't anyone tell me about this before?" "Your husband listed your home phone number as the primary contact, but someone has apparently been intercepting calls. We've left multiple messages over the past 3 months that were never returned. When we tried to reach you through the local police for a welfare check, we were told by a woman claiming to be your caretaker that you were too grief-stricken to handle legal matters." Caretaker. Yuki had been intercepting official communications and representing herself as my caretaker. The scope of her deception was staggering. "Mr. Morrison, she's been telling me that Japanese law overrides everything, that I have no rights as a foreign spouse." "Mrs. Caldwell, that's completely false when it comes to American assets. Your husband was very specific about this. He researched international inheritance law extensively and consulted with lawyers in both countries. The will he filed with us explicitly states that all property held in the United States, including your home, bank accounts, and investments, belong to you entirely." She showed me documents saying the accounts were frozen by Japanese authorities. "That's impossible without formal legal proceedings, which haven't occurred." "Mrs. Caldwell, I need to tell you something else. We've been investigating your sister-in-law's financial situation. She's facing significant debts in Japan, gambling losses, and failed business investments totaling over $2 million. She's desperate." The picture was becoming clear with horrifying precision. Yuki hadn't swooped in to help after Kenji's death. She'd been planning this theft for months, possibly years. Her frequent phone calls, her questions about our finances, her suggestions about transferring assets to Japan, it had all been preparation for this moment. "There's more," Mr. Morrison continued. "Your husband included a letter in his file, to be given to you, in case something like this happened. Would you like me to read it?" "Yes, please. My dearest Bertha, if you are hearing this letter, it means my worst fears about my family have come true. I am so sorry you are going through this alone, but please know that I have done everything possible to protect you. The woman I married is strong, intelligent, and deserving of respect. Do not let anyone convince you otherwise. You have been my partner in all things for 43 years, and you deserve every bit of the life we built together. Fight for what is yours. Fight for what is ours. With all my love, Kenji." I was crying now, tears of grief and relief and overwhelming love for a man who had protected me even in death. "What do I need to do?" "First, don't travel anywhere. Don't sign any documents. Don't give your sister-in-law any additional access to financial information. We're going to fax you copies of all the documents your husband filed, including the will, so you have legal proof of your rights. Bertha Yuki's voice called from the living room. Who are you talking to? I composed myself quickly. Just confirming tomorrow's travel arrangements. I called back. Second, Mr. Morrison continued, we're going to coordinate with local law enforcement and your bank to ensure your accounts are protected and to investigate any unauthorized access that may have occurred. What about Yuki? What happens to her? That depends on the extent of the fraud and whether you want to press charges. But Mrs. Caldwell, what she's done to you, the document forgery, the financial deception, the psychological manipulation, these are serious crimes. After I hung up, I sat in the kitchen for several minutes, trying to process the magnitude of what I'd learned. Kenji had known. He'd known his sister was capable of this betrayal, and he'd moved heaven and earth to protect me from it. The careful documentation, the embassy consultations, the international legal research, it was all evidence of a love so deep that it transcended death itself, but it was also evidence of something else. Kenji had known what kind of woman he'd married. He'd trusted me to be strong enough to fight when the time came. He'd believed I could stand up to manipulation and deception and emerge victorious. Now I had to prove him right. Bertha Yuki appeared in the kitchen doorway. Is everything all right? You look upset. For the first time in months, I looked at her clearly. I saw the expensive clothes purchased with money she didn't have, the designer handbag that cost more than most people's monthly rent, the careful makeup that couldn't quite hide the desperation in her eyes. I saw a woman drowning in debt who had decided to save herself by destroying me. Actually, Yuki, I said, standing up straighter than I had in weeks, I think we need to have a conversation. I led Yuki into the living room where she'd spent weeks, cataloging my possessions, where she'd convinced me I was powerless, where she'd systematically dismantled my confidence in my own rights. Now the room felt different. It felt like mine again. I just received some interesting information, I began, sitting in Kenji's favorite chair, from the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo. The change in Yuki's expression was instantaneous. The practiced sympathy vanished, replaced by something sharp and calculating. The embassy, what would they want with you? It seems my husband filed some documents with them before his death. Documents you failed to mention during all our conversations about inheritance law. Yuki's hand moved unconsciously to her purse, and I realized she was probably recording our conversation. Well, let her record it. The truth would serve me better than her lies. I don't know what you're talking about, she said carefully. The embassy has no role in inheritance matters. Actually, they do when American citizens need protection from foreign inheritance fraud. I let that word hang in the air between us. Fraud, Yuki, that's what they called it. You're being ridiculous. I've shown you all the legal documents, forged documents, misleading translations, false claims about account freezes that never happened. My voice was getting stronger with each word. The embassy has copies of Kenji's real will, Yuki, the one that leaves everything to me. For a moment, she said nothing. Then she laughed, but it was a brittle sound with no humor in it. You're confused, Bertha. Grief can make elderly people imagine things that aren't real. There it was, again, the dismissive reference to my age, the suggestion that I was mentally incompetent, but now I recognized it for what it was, a manipulation tactic designed to make me doubt my own perceptions. The embassy also told me about your debts, I continued. $2 million in gambling losses and failed investments. That's quite a lot of money to owe, isn't it? Yuki's composure finally cracked. You don't understand the pressures I'm under. My business partners, they're not patient people. I needed assets I could access quickly, so you decided to steal mine. I didn't steal anything. Her voice rose sharply. I'm Kenji's blood relative. I have legitimate inheritance rights under Japanese law, but we're not in Japan, are we? We're in Oregon, where American law applies to American assets, where my husband's will is perfectly valid and leaves everything to his wife of 43 years. I pulled out my phone and showed her the recording app that had been running since she'd entered the house. Would you like to repeat that confession about needing assets you could access quickly? Her face went white. You can't record me without my permission. Actually, in Oregon, I can. It's a one-party consent state, and you've just admitted on tape that you orchestrated this entire deception because you needed quick access to assets that weren't yours. Yuki stared at the phone, then at me. and I saw the exact moment when she realized her carefully constructed plan was falling apart. The polite, concerned sister-in-law disappeared entirely, replaced by someone desperate and dangerous. "You don't understand," she said, her voice taking on a pleading tone. "These people I owe money to, they'll kill me if I don't pay them back. I never meant to hurt you, but I didn't have a choice. There's always a choice, Yuki. You chose to manipulate a grieving widow. You chose to forge documents and lie about inheritance law. You chose to steal rather than find honest solutions to your problems. But you don't need all this money. You're old. You don't have children. You could live comfortably on much less. I have my whole life ahead of me." "Stop." The word came out sharper than I intended. "You're 58 years old, not 18. You created these debts through your own poor decisions, and you don't get to solve them by destroying other people's lives." She was crying now, but they seemed like calculated tears. "Please, Bertha, we're family. Kenji would want you to help family. Kenji wanted me to be protected from family who might try to take advantage of me. That's why he filed all those documents with the embassy. He knew exactly what kind of person you are." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden Kenji had tended for 20 years. He was preparing to update his will when he died, wasn't he? He was trying to make sure you couldn't do exactly what you've been doing. Yuki didn't answer, but her silence was confirmation enough. "The embassy is sending copies of all his legal documents by FACs within the hour," I continued. "They're also contacting the bank to restore my access to accounts you claimed were frozen, and they're working with local law enforcement to investigate the forged documents you've been showing me." "What do you want from me?" she asked quietly. "I want you to pack your belongings and leave my house. I want you to return any financial documents or personal items you've taken. And I want you to cancel that real estate listing you arranged, without my permission. And if I do that, then maybe I won't press charges for fraud, forgery, and elder abuse." She looked up at me with surprise. "You'd let me walk away?" "Kenji loved you once," I said. "Despite everything, you're his sister. I won't destroy you completely, but I won't let you destroy me either." Yuki gathered her papers and purse with shaking hands. At the door, she turned back one last time. "You know, he really did love you. More than he ever loved anyone in his family. I always hated him for that." After she left, I sat alone in the house that was truly mine again, holding Kenji's wedding ring and thinking about the depth of love it takes to protect someone, even after death. The inscription inside those Japanese characters, meaning eternal love, had proven to be more than just words. They were a promise kept. Detective Sarah Martinez arrived at my house the next morning with a briefcase full of documents and a recording device. She was younger than I'd expected, probably in her 40s, with kind eyes and a nonsense demeanor that immediately put me at ease. "Mrs. Caldwell, I've been briefed by the embassy, and I have to say, this is one of the most sophisticated inheritance fraud schemes I've ever encountered. Your sister-in-law clearly did extensive research on both Japanese and American law to make her deception convincing. We spread the evidence across my dining room table, the same table where Yuki had shown me her forged documents and false translations. Now it held the real papers. Kenji's authentic will, the embassy correspondence, bank records showing no account freezes, and legal opinions confirming that Japanese inheritance law had no jurisdiction over American assets. The document forgery alone is impressive, Detective Martinez said, examining the papers Yuki had shown me. She didn't just create fake documents, she created documents that contained enough real information to seem legitimate. The stamps, the formatting, even the legal language are sophisticated enough to fool most people. How did she get access to real Japanese legal documents to copy? We're still investigating that, but we believe she may have had help from someone with access to legal databases in Japan. This wasn't a solo operation. The detective showed me printouts of Yuki's financial records, obtained through international law enforcement cooperation. The gambling debts were even worse than the embassy had indicated, nearly $3 million owed to what appeared to be organized crime syndicates in Osaka and Tokyo. She was facing serious physical danger if she couldn't pay these debts, Detective Martinez explained. That doesn't excuse what she did to you, but it explains the desperation and the sophisticated planning. She wasn't just stealing money, she was stealing it to save her life. The investigation revealed the full scope of Yuki's deception. She had been intercepting my mail for months, redirecting official correspondence to a P.O. box she'd established using forged identification. The frozen bank accounts had never been frozen. Instead, she'd been attempting to gain access through fraudulent legal claims filed in Japan. She actually submitted paperwork to Japanese courts claiming you had abandoned your inheritance rights. The detective said, if you had signed the documents she was pressuring you to sign, those court filings would have been used to legitimize her theft. Most disturbing was the discovery that Yuki had been planning this for over a year before Kenji's death. Phone records showed extensive communications with gambling contacts, lawyers, and document forgers. She'd even hired a private investigator to research our financial holdings and property values. Your husband's sudden death was convenient for her timeline, but she was already preparing to claim inheritance rights even if he had lived. Detective Martinez explained, we found evidence that she was researching ways to have him declared mentally incompetent so she could gain control of his assets. The thought made me sick. While Kenji and I had been living our quiet retirement, trusting in the bonds of family, his sister had been plotting to destroy our security and steal our life's work. The phone calls, the questions about our finances, the suggestions about transferring assets to Japan, it had all been preparation for theft. The good news is that your husband anticipated much of this, the detective continued. His embassy filings included a detailed statement about his sister's financial problems and his concerns about potential inheritance fraud. He even documented specific conversations where she pressured him for financial information. She showed me copies of Kenji's sworn statements, written in his careful handwriting and notarized at the embassy. Reading his words, I could hear his voice. I am concerned that my sister Yuki may attempt to exploit Japanese inheritance laws to defraud my wife Bertha after my death. She has demonstrated an unhealthy interest in our financial affairs and has made several statements suggesting she believes she has legitimate claims to American assets. He also filed a formal complaint with Japanese authorities about harassment from family members seeking financial information. Detective Martinez said, that complaint is now being used to support fraud charges against your sister-in-law in Japan. The detective's investigation had uncovered something else that shocked me. Yuki had been running similar scams on other elderly Japanese-American couples. There were at least 3 other cases under investigation where she had used forged documents and false legal claims to steal inheritance money from vulnerable widows. She targeted women in your demographic specifically, the detective explained. Elderly American women married to Japanese men, particularly those without children, who might serve as advocates. She researched families through social media, obituaries, and community connections, then approached grieving widows with the same inheritance fraud scheme. How many people did she hurt? We're still investigating, but we believe she may have stolen over $500,000 from other victims before targeting you. Your case was going to be her biggest score. Your assets were worth significantly more than her previous targets. The investigation also revealed that Yuki's desperation had been escalating. The organized crime groups she owed money to had been increasing pressure, threatening not just her but family members in Japan. In her twisted logic, stealing from American widows was preferable to facing the consequences of her gambling addiction. She's facing serious charges in both countries now, Detective Martinez said. Fraud, forgery, elder abuse, and potentially racketeering. If we can prove the organized crime connections, she's looking at significant prison time. As the detective packed up her files, she handed me a business card. Mrs. Caldwell, I want you to know that your husband's preparations saved not just your financial security, but probably your life. Women in your situation often face depression, isolation, and health problems when they lose their homes and security. By protecting your assets, he protected your ability to maintain independence and dignity. That evening, I sat in my restored home, surrounded by possessions that were legally and unquestionably mine, and marveled at the depth of Kenji's love. He hadn't just anticipated betrayal, he'd prepared for it so thoroughly that even from beyond the grave, he'd been able to protect me. The man who'd learned to make my grandmother's apple pie, who'd spent hours researching every major purchase, who'd kept meticulous records of our shared life, had applied that same careful attention to ensuring I would never be vulnerable to the greed of others, even in death. He was still taking care of me. The legal process of reclaiming my life took 3 months, but each step felt like emerging from a dark tunnel into sunlight. The first victory came when the bank restored full access to all accounts that Yuki had claimed were frozen. Walking into the branch where Kenji and I had banked for 30 years and being treated as the rightful account holder again was an emotional moment I'll never forget. "Mrs. Caldwell, we're so sorry for any confusion about your account access," the branch manager said, clearly briefed by the legal department about the fraud investigation. "Your accounts were never actually frozen. Someone had been making false claims about court orders that didn't exist." The numbers on the statements were overwhelming. Not only had no money been taken, but our careful investments had continued to grow during the months I'd thought I was financially ruined. Kenji's planning had been so thorough that even his death hadn't disrupted our financial security. More satisfying was the day I met with the real estate agent Yuki had hired to list our house. The woman looked mortified when I explained that the listing had been arranged by someone with no legal authority to sell the property. "I'm so embarrassed," she said, immediately removing the listing from all websites and canceling scheduled showings. The woman who contacted me had such detailed information about the property that I never questioned her authority. She even knew about the renovation work you'd done on the kitchen. That detail chilled me. Yuki had been researching our property for so long that she knew intimate details about improvements we'd made years earlier. The scope of her preparation was both impressive and terrifying. The document recovery process revealed just how much Yuki had stolen beyond money. She'd taken photo albums, letters, even small pieces of jewelry that held sentimental value. Detective Martinez worked with Japanese authorities to recover these items from Yuki's apartment in Osaka, where they'd been catalogued as inheritance, assets she planned to sell. When the box of recovered items arrived by international courier, I cried opening it. Inside were the love letters Kenji had written during our courtship, the small ceramic bowl he'd made in pottery class, my mother-in-law, recipe cards written in careful Japanese characters, and dozens of photographs I'd thought were lost forever. But the most meaningful recovery was less tangible: my sense of self-worth. For months, Yuki had convinced me I was a confused elderly woman who didn't understand complex legal matters. She'd made me feel like a burden, a foreigner with no legitimate claim to the life I'd built with my husband. Now I understood that I was none of those things. I was a woman who had built a successful career, maintained a loving marriage across cultural differences, and possessed the intelligence and strength to fight back when threatened. Kenji had known that about me, even when I'd temporarily forgotten it myself. The paperwork restoring my property ownership was particularly satisfying. The deed that Yuki had claimed was invalid was not only valid but reinforced by decades of tax records, insurance policies, and legal documents that clearly established my rights as joint owner and, after Kenji's death, sole owner. "Your husband was remarkably thorough," the lawyer handling the recovery process told me. "Every document is properly executed. Every legal requirement is met. This is textbook estate planning for international marriages." Friends and neighbors who had watched the drama unfold were amazed by the reversal. Margaret, my neighbor who had first voiced suspicions about Yuki's claims, was particularly gratified. "I knew something wasn't right," she said as we sat in my garden, which I was finally able to enjoy again. "Kenji loved you too much to leave you vulnerable, and you're too smart to be fooled indefinitely." The financial advisor who had worked with Kenji and me for 20 years was equally relieved. "When we stopped hearing from you, we were concerned," he admitted. "Your husband had specifically asked us to maintain regular contact and help you navigate any inheritance issues. When someone claiming to be your caretaker told us you didn't want to discuss financial matters, it raised red flags." Those red flags had led to the advisor contacting the embassy, which had ultimately led to my rescue. Even people I barely knew had been working to protect me because Kenji had asked them to watch out for exactly what had happened. The restored bank accounts allowed me to repay the few friends who had offered financial help during my darkest period. More importantly, it allowed me to plan for a future I'd thought was lost. The house would remain mine, the investments would continue to grow, and the security Kenji and I had built together would support me for the rest of my life. But perhaps the most meaningful part of the recovery was reconnecting with the Japanese side of our family, the relatives who hadn't been involved in Yuki's scheme. Kenji's cousin in Tokyo, who had heard about the fraud investigation, called to express his horror at what had happened. "Yuki brought great shame to our family," he said in careful English. "Kenji-san was respected man. You are respected wife. We are sorry for this trouble." That conversation, conducted in a mixture of English and the basic Japanese phrases Kenji had taught me over the years, reminded me that cultural differences had never been the real issue. The issue had been one person's greed and desperation, which transcended any cultural boundaries. As I signed the final papers restoring my complete legal and financial status, I thought about the woman I'd been 6 months earlier, secure and blissfully unaware of how quickly life could change. The woman I'd become was different, more cautious perhaps, but also stronger and more appreciative of the protections that love and careful planning could provide. Kenji's eternal love, inscribed in Japanese characters inside his wedding ring, had proven to be more than romantic sentiment. It had been a practical promise, backed by legal documents, embassy filings, and the kind of thorough preparation that only comes from truly understanding both the depth of love and the potential for betrayal. The court proceedings in both countries moved faster than I'd expected. Yuki's desperation had made her sloppy, and the evidence against her was overwhelming. In Japan, she faced charges for fraud, document forgery, and organized crime associations. In Oregon, she was charged with elder abuse, fraud, and attempted theft. I was asked to provide victim impact testimony for both courts, though the Oregon proceedings were conducted via video conference to spare me the expense and stress of international travel. Sitting in the courthouse where Kenji and I had handled routine legal matters for decades, I faced a camera and spoke directly to Japanese judges about the impact of Yuki's betrayal. "She didn't just try to steal my money," I said, reading from a statement I'd carefully prepared. "She tried to steal my identity as Kenji's wife, my legitimacy as a partner in our marriage, and my dignity as an intelligent woman capable of understanding my own legal rights." The Japanese prosecutor had explained that Yuki's crimes were particularly serious under their legal system because they involved dishonoring family relationships and exploiting cultural differences for criminal gain. "In Japan, family duty is very important," he said through a translator. What she did violated not just law, but cultural values. The organized crime connections made her situation even worse. The gambling debts that had driven her to fraud had put her in business with Yakuza-affiliated loan sharks, and her attempts to steal American assets to pay Japanese crime syndicates created international law enforcement concerns. "She faces minimum 5 years in Japanese prison," Detective Martinez explained to me, "possibly more if they can prove she was laundering money through the inheritance fraud scheme." But what surprised me was Yuki's final attempt at manipulation. 2 weeks before her sentencing, she sent me a letter through her lawyer, asking for mercy and claiming she'd been acting out of love for family. "I only wanted to preserve Kenji's assets within the family," she wrote. "In Japanese culture, blood relatives have responsibility to maintain family wealth. I thought you would understand and want to honor our traditions." The letter was a masterpiece of manipulation, trying to reframe her theft as cultural preservation and my resistance as cultural insensitivity. But I was no longer the confused, grieving woman who might have believed such nonsense. Instead, I wrote my own letter to be read at her sentencing. Yuki Tanaka dishonored both American and Japanese values through her crimes. She exploited my grief, manipulated cultural differences, and violated the trust that family relationships require. Her actions brought shame not just to herself, but to the memory of my husband, who specifically prepared legal protections because he knew she couldn't be trusted. The final court judgment was more comprehensive than I'd expected. Yuki was sentenced to 6 years in Japanese prison, followed by deportation proceedings that would likely bar her from entering the United States for life. She was also ordered to pay full restitution for all investigative costs, legal fees, and damages money she didn't have, but which could be garnished from any future earnings. More satisfying was the broader impact of the case. The international cooperation between American and Japanese law enforcement had exposed the inheritance fraud network Yuki had been part of, leading to additional arrests and the recovery of money stolen from other elderly victims. "Your case became the model for how to handle these types of international elder abuse situations," Detective Martinez told me. "The embassy has already updated their protocols for protecting American citizens married to foreign nationals." The local prosecutor also used Yuki's case to educate other potential victims. "We're seeing more of these inheritance fraud schemes targeting elderly Americans with foreign-born spouses," she explained at a community meeting I attended. Mrs. Caldwell's experience shows how important it is to verify legal claims independently and seek help when something doesn't feel right. But the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. The Japanese consul in Portland requested a meeting to formally apologize for Yuki's abuse of cultural and legal differences. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said in perfect English, "this woman's actions were completely contrary to Japanese values of family respect and honor. Your husband was wise to seek embassy protection, and you were brave to fight for justice." He presented me with a formal letter of commendation from the Japanese government, recognizing my role in exposing an international crime network and helping to protect other potential victims. The letter was written in both Japanese and English, and included a phrase that made me cry. "In honor of a marriage that transcended cultural boundaries through mutual respect and love." The consul also shared something that the investigation had revealed about Kenji's final trip to Japan. "Your husband's business meetings in Hiroshima were actually with lawyers and embassy officials," he said. "He was finalizing additional protections for you, including arrangements for simplified repatriation of assets in case of inheritance disputes." Even in his final days, Kenji had been working to protect me. The heart attack that killed him had interrupted his mission to create even stronger legal shields against exactly what Yuki had attempted. As I left the courthouse after Yuki's final sentencing, I thought about justice and forgiveness. I felt no satisfaction in her imprisonment, but I felt deep relief that she could no longer hurt other vulnerable people. The organized crime debts that had driven her to such desperate measures would follow her to prison and beyond, ensuring that even after serving her sentence, she would face consequences for years to come. Most importantly, the legal precedent set by our case would help protect other elderly Americans in similar situations. The embassy protocols Kenji had helped establish were now being used to safeguard other widows and widowers facing inheritance challenges across cultural and national boundaries. Standing outside the courthouse, I touched the wedding ring that Yuki had once told me was legally meaningless. The inscription inside those Japanese characters meaning eternal love had proven more powerful than any legal document she could forge. Kenji's love had not only endured beyond death, it had reached across international boundaries to bring justice and create protections for others facing similar betrayals. That was a legacy worth more than any inheritance. The trauma of betrayal leaves scars that money and legal victories cannot heal. Even with my financial security restored and justice served, I found myself struggling with trust, sleep, and the simple act of believing in my own judgment. The woman who had managed a university library for 30 years, who had navigated the complexities of an interracial marriage with confidence and grace, had been shaken to her core by months of systematic manipulation. Dr. Patricia Williams, the therapist recommended by Detective Martinez, specialized in elder abuse recovery. "What you experienced wasn't just financial fraud," she explained during our first session. "It was psychological warfare designed to make you doubt your own reality. That kind of manipulation leaves deep wounds." The therapy sessions were harder than I'd expected, talking about how easily I'd been deceived, how thoroughly I'd believed Yuki's lies, brought up feelings of shame and self-doubt that were difficult to face. "How could I have been so stupid?" I asked repeatedly. "You weren't stupid," Dr. Williams replied. "You were grieving, isolated, and facing someone who had spent months preparing to exploit your vulnerabilities. The fact that you eventually fought back shows strength, not weakness." She helped me understand that Yuki's manipulation had been sophisticated and targeted. She exploited your respect for family, your unfamiliarity with Japanese law, and your cultural sensitivity about being a white woman in an interracial marriage. Those aren't weaknesses, they're values that she weaponized against you. The healing process involved more than just therapy. I had to relearn how to trust my own instincts, how to feel secure in my own home, how to believe that I deserved the life Kenji and I had built together. Some days were harder than others. The memorial garden I created in our backyard became a crucial part of that healing. Working with my hands, planting flowers that Kenji had loved, creating something beautiful from the earth he'd once tended, helped me reconnect with the life we'd shared before. Yuki's betrayal tainted everything. The garden's centerpiece was a stone bench with an inscription in both English and Japanese, in memory of Kenji Caldwell, whose love transcended death and whose wisdom protected those he cherished. Below that, in smaller letters, "Eternal love endures." Sitting on that bench in the evenings, I would read through the letters Yuki had stolen and then returned. evidence of a love that had survived not just cultural differences and geographic distance, but death itself and the greed of family members. Those letters reminded me of who I really was, not a confused elderly woman, but a partner in a remarkable marriage that had enriched both our lives. The physical recovery was easier than the emotional one. My health, which had suffered during the months of stress and uncertainty, gradually improved as my security returned. I started sleeping through the night again, eating regular meals, and taking care of the house that was unquestionably mine. But the most healing moments came from unexpected connections with others who had faced similar challenges. The prosecutor's office connected me with 2 other women who had been targeted by inheritance fraud schemes, not by Yuki, but by other criminals using similar tactics. They made me feel so stupid, said Maria, a 74-year-old widow whose stepchildren had tried to steal her home after her husband's death. Like I didn't understand my own legal rights because I was just an immigrant wife. They made me feel like a burden, added Janet, whose late husband's business partner had attempted to claim ownership of assets she'd helped build, like I was lucky to get anything at all, instead of being entitled to what was legally mine. These conversations helped me understand that my experience wasn't unique or shameful. Criminals who targeted elderly people, especially women, used similar psychological tactics regardless of the specific legal or cultural details. The goal was always the same: make the victim doubt their own worth and legitimacy until they surrendered what was rightfully theirs. Dr. Williams encouraged me to channel my healing into helping others. You have knowledge and experience that could protect other people from what you went through, she said. Sometimes the best way to heal from trauma is to prevent others from experiencing the same pain. The idea appealed to me. For 30 years, I'd helped people find the information they needed in the library. Now I could help people find the protection they needed from inheritance fraud and elder abuse. I started small, volunteering with the local senior center to give presentations about recognizing financial manipulation. The first time I stood in front of a room full of elderly people and told my story, my hands shook and my voice wavered, but the questions they asked and the gratitude they expressed made it worthwhile. I thought I was the only one who fell for something like this, said one woman after my presentation. Thank you for making me feel less alone. The memorial garden grew throughout that first year of healing. I added new plants each season, creating a living tribute to the man whose love had saved me from financial ruin and emotional destruction. Friends and neighbors often stopped by to admire the flowers and share memories of Kenji, turning what could have been a lonely space into a community gathering place. By winter, almost a year after Kenji's death and 8 months after Yuki's sentencing, I could honestly say I felt whole again. Not the same as before. Trauma changes you permanently, but healed in ways that made me stronger and more compassionate. The inscription on Kenji's wedding ring had proven prophetic. Eternal love does endure, but not just as a romantic ideal. It endures as protection, as wisdom, as the practical gift of legal documents and embassy filings that shield the beloved from harm, even after death. Sitting in my garden on the anniversary of that terrible embassy call that had changed everything, I felt profound gratitude, not just for being saved, but for being trusted with the strength to save myself when the time came. 2 years after Yuki's conviction, I found myself in a place I never could have imagined, serving as a volunteer advocate for elderly victims of financial abuse. The badge hanging around my neck reads Senior Protection Advocate, and it represented a purpose I'd discovered in the aftermath of my own victimization. The work came naturally to someone who had spent decades helping people find information and resources. Now, instead of locating books and research materials, I helped vulnerable seniors locate legal assistance, understand their rights, and recognize the warning signs of financial manipulation. Mrs. Caldwell, said Rosa Martinez, a 68-year-old woman whose adult children were pressuring her to sign over her house. They keep telling me it's for my own good, that I'm too old to handle property ownership. But something doesn't feel right. I recognized that feeling immediately, the same instinct that had eventually led me to question Yuki's claims, even when grief and confusion clouded my judgment. Trust that feeling, I told her. When someone rushes you to make major financial decisions, especially family members who claim to know what's best for you, that's a red flag. Working with Rosa and others like her, I discovered that inheritance, fraud, and elder financial abuse crossed all cultural and economic boundaries. The tactics were remarkably similar, whether the perpetrators were adult children, step-family members, caregivers, or supposed friends. The goal was always to isolate the victim, create urgency, and undermine their confidence in their own judgment. You're particularly effective with victims of family fraud, observed Linda Thompson, the social worker who coordinated our volunteer program. I think it's because you understand how devastating it is when the people who should protect you are the ones trying to harm you. That understanding had come at a terrible cost, but it allowed me to connect with people in ways that professional counselors sometimes couldn't. When a tearful widow told me her late husband's brother was claiming she had no rights to their jointly owned business, I could speak from experience about the specific pain of having your marriage's legitimacy questioned by family members. The most rewarding cases involved women in interracial or international marriages who faced additional layers of manipulation. I worked with Alina, whose late husband's family in Mexico claimed American inheritance law didn't apply to their property. I helped Sarah, whose Korean in-laws insisted she needed to follow traditional customs that would have left her financially dependent on relatives who barely acknowledged her existence. They made me feel like I was disrespecting my husband's culture by wanting to keep our house, Alina confided, like I was being selfish for not understanding that family property should stay with blood relatives. Culture is never an excuse for theft, I told her, words I'd learned to say with conviction. Real cultural values include respecting marriage, honoring commitments, and protecting vulnerable family members. What they're doing violates any culture's actual values. These conversations often took place in my garden, where the memorial stone for Kenji provided a peaceful backdrop for difficult discussions. Many of the women I worked with found comfort in hearing about a man who had loved his American wife enough to protect her from his own family's potential greed. Your husband sounds like he really understood love, said Grace, a 71-year-old African-American woman whose late Chinese husband's family was challenging his will. A lot of men from traditional cultures don't think that far ahead about protecting their wives from family interference. The advocacy work also connected me with legal professionals who specialized in elder abuse cases. I testified before the state legislature about the need for stronger protections for elderly victims of inheritance fraud, particularly those involving international or cross-cultural elements. Mrs. Caldwell's case demonstrated how criminals exploit cultural differences and legal complexity to confuse and manipulate elderly victims. I told the lawmakers, we need clearer laws and better resources to help people in these situations. That testimony led to new legislation requiring more stringent verification procedures for inheritance claims involving foreign law, and expanded funding for elder abuse investigation and victim services. Knowing that my terrible experience was helping to protect others from similar fraud gave meaning to the pain I'd endured. The volunteer work also helped me build new friendships and community connections that had been damaged during the months when Yuki isolated me from my support systems. Margaret, my neighbor who had first questioned Yuki's claims, became not just a friend but a fellow advocate who helped me organize community education workshops. You've turned something awful into something beautiful, she observed as we planned a presentation for the local community center. Kenji would be proud of what you've built from his protection. The most unexpected development was reconnecting with the positive side of Japanese culture that Yuki's betrayal had temporarily tainted for me. The Japanese consul who had apologized for Yuki's crimes introduced me to a local cultural organization that supported international families and cross-cultural understanding. Your experience shows both the worst and best of family relationships, said Mrs. Kimura, the organization's president. Your husband's love and protection represent true family values, while his sister's crimes represent individual corruption, not cultural failure. Working with the cultural organization helped me reclaim the Japanese elements of my life that had brought joy during my marriage with Kenji. I resumed practicing calligraphy, continued tending the Japanese maple trees in our garden, and even started teaching basic Japanese phrases to other elderly Americans. Married to Japanese spouses, the volunteer badge around my neck represented more than just a role. It represented a new identity built from the ashes of victimization. I was no longer just Kenji's widow or Yuki's target. I was an advocate, an educator, and a protector of others who faced similar vulnerabilities. Standing in my garden on a spring evening, 2 years after the embassy call that had saved my life, I could honestly say I felt useful again. The memorial stone caught the last rays of sunlight, and I whispered a quiet thank you to the man whose love had not only protected me, but had somehow guided me toward protecting others. This was what eternal love looked like in practice, not just romantic sentiment, but active protection that rippled outward to shelter strangers who needed help finding their own strength. 5 years have passed since that devastating phone call that changed my world, and 3 years since the embassy call that saved it. As I sit in my garden this morning, watching the sunrise illuminate the memorial stone where Kenji's name is carved in both English and Japanese, I'm struck by how completely my life has been transformed by the experience of nearly losing everything. The memory box sitting beside me on the bench contains artifacts from this journey that I never could have imagined collecting. There's the business card from Detective Martinez, who became not just my advocate but a friend, the first letter of gratitude from a woman I helped protect from inheritance fraud, the legislative commendation recognizing my advocacy work, the photo of me speaking at the International Conference on Elder Abuse Prevention, where I shared Kenji's story as an example of protective love that transcends death. But perhaps most meaningful is the simple thank you note from Rosa Martinez, the woman whose adult children had been pressuring her to sign over her house. "Because of you, I found the courage to say no," she wrote. "I kept my home and my dignity. Your husband's love protected you, and through you, it protected me too." That's what I've come to understand about legacy. It's not just what we leave behind, but what our experiences enable others to build. Kenji's meticulous preparation didn't just save my financial security, it created a template for protection that has helped dozens of other vulnerable seniors maintain their independence and dignity. The international conference where I spoke last month brought together experts from 12 countries dealing with cross-border inheritance fraud. The protocols that Kenji helped establish through his embassy filings have been adopted by consulates worldwide, creating a network of protection for Americans married to foreign nationals. "Your case became the model," explained Dr. Jennifer Walsh, who studies international elder abuse patterns. "The documentation your husband provided, combined with your willingness to share your experience publicly, has prevented countless similar frauds. I think often about the woman I was before this ordeal. Confident in my marriage but naive about the potential for family betrayal. Financially secure but unaware of how quickly that security could be threatened by someone willing to exploit legal complexity and cultural differences. That woman was happy but perhaps a bit complacent about the protections that love and law could provide. The woman I've become is different. I'm more cautious but also more courageous, more aware of vulnerability, but also more confident in my ability to recognize and fight manipulation. Most importantly, I understand now that survival isn't just about enduring trauma. It's about transforming that experience into wisdom that can protect others. The garden around me has grown beyond a simple memorial into something resembling a small community center. Neighbors stop by regularly to check on the flowers and share news. Other elderly people in vulnerable situations often seek me out for advice and support. The bench where I sit has become an informal counseling space where people find the courage to trust their instincts and seek help. Yesterday, a 73-year-old man named Robert visited, worried about his new wife's adult children who were pressuring him to add their names to his property deed for estate planning purposes. As we talked, I saw my own confusion and fear reflected in his uncertainty. "They make it sound so reasonable," he said. "Like I'm being stubborn for wanting to maintain control of assets I worked 40 years to accumulate." "Reasonable people don't rush you into major financial decisions," I told him. Words I've learned to say with absolute certainty. Reasonable people want you to consult with independent lawyers and take time to understand exactly what you're signing. By the time he left, Robert had the phone number for 3 different elder law attorneys and a plan to protect himself from financial manipulation. Watching him walk away with renewed confidence reminded me why this work feels like a calling rather than just volunteer service. The memory box also contains something I never expected to treasure: a letter from Yuki herself, written from prison 2 years into her sentence. The letter was brief and, in its way, honest. "I never meant to hurt you personally," she wrote. "I was drowning in debt and terrified for my life. That doesn't excuse what I did, but I want you to know I'm grateful you didn't let them destroy me completely. Prison has given me time to understand how wrong I was. I don't know if I believe her remorse is genuine, but I no longer feel anger toward her. The woman who tried to steal my life was herself drowning. making terrible choices from desperation and greed. Her actions were inexcusable, but her humanity was never entirely absent, just buried under panic and poor judgment. The inscription on Kenji's wedding ring, those Japanese characters meaning eternal love, proved to be more prophetic than either of us could have known when we chose them 43 years ago. His love did endure eternally, but not just as romantic memory. It endured as practical protection, legal wisdom, and the foundation for a new life built on helping others avoid the betrayal I experienced. Sometimes people ask if I'm bitter about the months of terror and uncertainty Yuki put me through. The question always surprises me because the answer is so clearly no. Those months were horrible, but they led to discoveries about strength I didn't know I possessed, purpose I hadn't previously found, and connections with people I never would have met. More importantly, they proved the depth of Kenji's love in ways that decades of peaceful marriage never could have demonstrated. Anyone can love someone during good times. It takes extraordinary love to protect someone from beyond the grave, to anticipate dangers and prepare defenses against betrayals that might never occur. As I close the memory box and prepare to start another day of advocacy work, I'm struck by how completely my understanding of justice has evolved. Justice isn't just about punishment for wrongdoing. Though Yuki's imprisonment was necessary and appropriate, justice is about restoration, protection, and the transformation of victimization into empowerment. The life I live now, helping other elderly people recognize and resist financial manipulation, is a form of justice that honors both my own survival and Kenji's protective love. Every person I help stay independent, every fraud I help expose, every law I help strengthen represents a victory for the values that our marriage embodied: mutual respect, careful planning, and the belief that love should make people stronger, not more vulnerable. If you've ever felt powerless in your darkest moment, I want you to know that survival is possible, justice is achievable, and love really can transcend even death itself. Sometimes the protection we need comes from unexpected sources, but it's always worth fighting for the life and dignity we deserve. The sun is fully up now, warming the garden where Kenji's memory lives on in every flower, every visitor, every conversation that helps someone find courage they didn't know they possessed. This is what eternal love looks like when it's lived rather than just remembered. Then endless ripple of protection spreading outward to shelter others facing their own dark moments. That's a legacy worth more than any inheritance.